So if you'll go ahead and take your seats, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute here at WSU, and on behalf of the Institute, I'd like to welcome you out to our event today. We're going to have a very lively discussion, I hope, with Rick Garza, who currently serves as the director of the Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board. It used to be the control board.
That's correct.
They got rid of the control part.
They did.
Rick has worked with the board since 1997 and previously held the positions of policy director and deputy director. Before joining the board, Rick served 13 years as a staff member for the Washington State Legislature, including 5 years with the state Senate and 8 years with the state House. And he's going to be talking about the ongoing efforts to implement Initiative 502, which is an initiative, of course, that legalizes marijuana in the state of Washington.
Thank you. So good afternoon. So the first thing I have to tell you is I grew up in Eastern Washington in the Yakima Valley, and this is the first time I've ever come on campus. So I'm embarrassed to say that. But it's great to be here. It's a beautiful school, and of course we have great weather, just like I grew up in Eastern Washington. So this is what I want to do. I want to spend about 30 minutes walking through the whole experience of legalizing marijuana in Washington, and then I just want to open it up and take questions from you, comments, input about how this is working or not working. I actually drove into town and realized that unlike most of Eastern Washington that has bans and moratorias, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, Pullman, my understanding, has 2 retail locations and is looking possibly at a 3rd one. But we'll talk a little bit about the politics of that with respect to Eastern Washington versus Western Washington. So I'm going to go through this as quickly as I can so that I can give you an opportunity to ask questions. And just go ahead and jump in wherever you want. Maybe just raise your hand or just go ahead and ask questions as I go through it. It's a lot of information that I want to provide you, but there's a lot that's been going on the last 2.5 years as it became law. So what happened in November of 2012? Like Colorado, and again, the first 2 states in the union, Colorado has a regulated medical marijuana marketplace since '98. We've had a medical marijuana law passed by initiative in '98 that's unregulated. And I'll talk a little bit about a bill that passed to reconcile medical along with recreational. But what happened at that time is it became legal. And I'll tell you what's interesting. Allison Holcomb wrote this initiative. She's the policy director for the ACLU out of Washington. And if you recall the campaign that was written, it really was for her the issue of social justice and the criminal justice element with respect to the legalization of marijuana. I'm not going to get into the policy piece of it, but you probably are aware from her point of view, the war on drugs had been a failure. Many of the people that are incarcerated tend to be people of color, and her aim was one more at criminal justice reform and social reform. And then we'll talk a little bit about it. I'd love to hear from you. What about the change in policy? What do we need to be concerned about as we look out the next 5 and 10 years? So obviously, like alcohol, and the reason I brought her up was, I said, Allison, why did you pick the Liquor Control Board as a regulatory agency? And she said, well, why wouldn't I? What do they regulate? They regulate drugs. What is cannabis? Cannabis is a drug like alcohol. The licensing requirements that I'm going to share with you and the enforcement penalties are very similar to alcohol. And she did that purposely, I think, one, because she felt that was a way to legalize marijuana, is to say if we strictly regulate and control the sale of marijuana, then maybe the voters will approve this. And then the revenues, we'll talk about the money that goes to benefit health and prevention that was placed in the initiative. But basically, if you're 21 years of age, you can possess an ounce of usable marijuana, 16 ounces in solid form. And before I got involved in this, I had no idea all the different ways that people process marijuana, the infused and the edibles. Those weren't around when I was around in the 70s and 80s. They just didn't exist. Beverages that have infused marijuana in them, never heard of anything like that before. And so much like our alcohol system, the initiative actually created 3 tiers of the industry: a producer license, a processor license, and then a retail license. And initially, when the initiative was written, the Office of Financial Management, the Budget Office of the Governor, is required to write a fiscal impact statement. They have to try to determine what's it going to cost to regulate this new industry and how much money is going to come into this new industry. Well, the only thing they could set their eyes on was $1 to $2 billion over 5 years. So, like 0 to $2 billion. They had no idea how they were going to be able to determine what the size is, because unlike Colorado, which has a regulated medical marijuana marketplace, which they could kind of determine what it could be because they had a licensure system and a regulated system. For medical, we had none, and of course we didn't have any idea how big the black market was, but because they had to make some kind of projections, they made a projection, at least for fiscal year 2015, which just ended, the 36.3 million would come in. The public safety and education piece, a lot of the medical marijuana patients, if you remember, opposed this initiative. And one of the reasons they opposed it was they didn't like a THC bloodstream threshold law, like our alcohol law that we have, where if you have 5 nanograms of THC in your system and you got pulled over and the active ingredient when they did the blood test was shown, you could be written up like a DUI. And so there was concerns by medical, if you remember the campaign several years ago, with respect to that blood stream threshold. There were limits on the number of store locations in the law, limits to advertising that can occur, and then there were revenues that were earmarked for healthcare research and education, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So our objective was, we were given until December of the next year to write regulations around the new law. And to be honest with you, much of it was already in the law. It's not a lot that we had to do, but we did have to determine the size of the marketplace. We did have to determine how many retail locations we were going to open statewide. That's not something that Colorado had to do. Some people ask, what's the difference between what happened in Colorado and Washington? Colorado already had a regulated medical marketplace, as I said before, with licensure. So what Colorado did was simply allow those who had a medical license to get a recreational license. And they're vertically integrated in Colorado. I can be a producer, a processor, and a retailer of marijuana for medical and now for recreational. This became more difficult in Washington because what the initiative did was it created a 3-tier system similar to alcohol. It said, if I'm a producer or a processor of marijuana, I can never hold a retail license. And if I'm a retailer of marijuana, I can never hold a producer-processor license. Well, that smacked right into the vertical integration that many in the medical marketplace have today. And so they kind of paused and backed up and said, I don't want anything to do with this because, for instance, I treat medical patients and I want to be able to grow for them, process, and I want to be able to dispense for them. And so there was a complete reaction, as you can imagine, from those involved in the medical marketplace who said, why is the liquor board doing this? It's like, no, we didn't do this. The law did this. The initiative did this. So we didn't have the ability to create a vertically integrated marketplace. But to be honest with you, when I look at it now, after the last few years, I would think that would be a good thing to do. So can you imagine why Allison Holcomb created this split in the tiers where there could be no tie between the producer, processor, and the retailer? So she believed that her concern by this marketplace was she didn't want it to become like the alcohol industry, where you had, for instance, in the beer industry, you have 2 companies that sell 70% of the beer. Anheuser-Busch, which is now InBev, and Sam Miller, which is the old Miller company. She did not want people to be able to, or the monopoly of tobacco to come in and control this marketplace. So there's actually restrictions in the law for the number of licenses that you can hold as a producer, a processor, and a retailer. You can only hold 1 license as a retailer and 3 licenses as a producer or a processor. And the idea there again was to allow as many people into this marketplace as possible and not allow for one conglomerate company to control the cannabis market. And so that's an issue that's been difficult, again, for the reconciliation with medical, and I'll get into more of that in a minute. So what is the liquor board's role? And then we're going to talk a little bit about the Department of Health's role now that the reconciliation is occurring. So I talked about this 3-tier regulatory system of the producer, the processor, and the retailer. Obviously, we created licenses. We actually have marijuana enforcement officers like we have liquor enforcement officers around the state. that enforce with our producers or processors and retailers to actually do compliance checks. We did that a few months ago, and I'll talk about that. And then we collect and distribute taxes and fees from the new industry. So I shouldn't have shown you that slide. So what's the biggest threat to this legal cannabis marketplace in Washington? What would you guess? What's the biggest threat to it? Yeah.
High prices.
Black market.
So don't forget the one about the high prices, because Allison Holcomb told me something interesting when the law, when we started implementing the rules, because I thought the taxes were high too, at 36%. Now, they were just placed by the legislature into the retail. The retailer is going to collect that 36% tax. The initiative had a 25% tax that was imposed. It was really only 25 and 25 because most of the folks hold a producer processor license, the combination of the two, and they only pay 25% on that. But I don't want to lose that because she had some interesting information that's kind of come forward. So the biggest threat is the federal government. So until August of the next year, if you can imagine this, and the initiative passed in November, we had no idea whether we were going to remain open or not, or whether the feds were going to step in to Colorado and Washington and say, what? This is ridiculous. You can't legalize marijuana in your states because not only is it's a Schedule I controlled substance. There's nothing more egregious than that. Remember, a Schedule II, which is what people want medical marijuana to be scheduled at, allows for it to be what? There's a therapeutic value to it if it's a Schedule II. Schedule I basically is the same as heroin. And so think about the fact that you've got the federal government looking at our states saying, what are you going to do? We waited. We put our rules together pretty much, and what I'm showing you here is in August, the feds put a memorandum out from Deputy Cole, the Department of Justice, that basically said you must adhere to these 8 enforcement priorities or principles, or we're going to basically bring you down. Now, they didn't say that, but that's what they meant. And it really goes into 3 areas, and I'm going to share them really quickly because those are the 3 areas that we wrote the regulations about, and it's very difficult. One was preventing distribution to minors. How are you going to keep it out of the hands of young people, right? Which is very difficult today, even before it was legal. So I'll share with you the rules that we put together that we think do that. The second was diversion. How are you going to keep marijuana from flowing out of Washington to Oregon, to British Columbia, to Idaho? Now, ironically, what happened this last year? Oregon went legal. Alaska went legal. Very likely California will go legal next year. I heard it. I was on a panel with Allison Holcomb in San Diego a few months ago, and I'll tell you something she said that was fascinating. I said, well, Allison, the question was, what about all these other states that are going to be on the ballot? She said, keep in mind that California has the 7th largest economy in the world. Now, I was baffled by that. I had no idea that California could have that kind of an economy, but they do. In fact, 90% of the pot that's grown in California is exported out of the state. And remember the term that what's been the #1 cash crop in California for 15, 20 years? Cannabis. So she's of the opinion that when California legalizes, if it does, it will have a ripple effect in the country. Most of the West Coast, most of the East Coast have initiatives and referendums, which is why this legalization is occurring. So a little poli-sci for a second. If you're in the South, you're in the Midwest, they don't have, for the most part, referendum or initiative processes. They have been trying by the legislature before Initiative I-502 to legalize marijuana in Washington. They couldn't even get the bill out of committee. Had we not had the initiative or referendum process, I believe that there's no way that this would have been legalized. In those states, the legislatures, as well as ours, tend to be more conservative than the people. That's why you've got so many initiatives in California, for example. So keep in mind that while the West Coast and the East Coast, I think, is going to continue, and I think more the Northeast Coast is going to continue to legalize, whether that's medical, that's now 24 states, or whether it's recreational, probably the South and the Midwest will move more slowly because they don't have that process. So I diverted for a moment. But anyway, that diversion issue was one that was of concern to the feds. And I'll talk about the traceability system, the way that we require producers and processors and retailers on a daily basis to provide us information about what's happening on their premises. And then the third was, you've got to keep the criminal element out from holding these licenses. And so the way that we did that, and that was already in the initiative, were strict requirements with respect to a criminal background check, a fingerprint, not only from the State Patrol in Washington, but one with the FBI where we can actually look and see if there's been issues around the country. There's actually a point system. So if you're going to legalize something that's been illegal forever, how are you going to move people into this marketplace? So there's actually a point system. You can have a felony for distribution of marijuana as long as it happened at least 10 years ago. And so we look on a case-by-case basis for what was the issue, what was the arrest, what were the convictions. If it's egregious, in some instances we've said, no, we're not going to allow you to hold a license. But I think the intent here, and we have the same point system for alcohol, is if you're going to bring something out of the shadows, you're going to have to allow some people who may have had arrests or convictions into the marketplace. And so that was our way of dealing with the federal guidelines, but I keep in mind for all of you, because Oregon's just started their retail sales in October, and they're having some issues there. And I think we always have concerns in Washington or Colorado. If Oregon's having issues, the feds may step in. I don't honestly think that's going to happen, but that is of concern. So we walked into this thing having what? Absolutely no idea what this plant was about, how it's produced, how it's processed, how it's retailed. So we actually did an RFP, and we went out to find a consultant. And Dr. Mark Kleiman's pretty well known around the country and around the world as an expert around cannabis. And then he hired a couple of different folks. Dr. Bo Kilmer with the RAND Corporation actually went out and surveyed by county and by city, believe it or not, how many people consume marijuana who are over 21 and how much do they consume. And from that came an estimate at the time that in Washington 140 tons of marijuana is consumed yearly by those over 21. And that was the point by which we began to determine the amount of pot that would need to be grown. And believe it or not, it was difficult. Unlike Colorado, we had to actually estimate how much marijuana would need to be grown, and then we had to determine the number of retail locations. And we actually have Dr. Kilmer right now coming back to us in the middle of November with some estimates on how large the medical marketplace is in Washington since I-502 passed. And so what I'll throw out there, because I'm from Thurston County, I live in Olympia and have been there forever. When I-502 passed, those that were not able to get into the marketplace did what in Washington? They opened medical dispensaries. We've seen a tripling of the number of medical dispensaries in the state since I-502 passed. And that has created issues in lots of communities who just believe there's too many of them. But I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, and I'm going way too slow, aren't I? Because I'm already at 25 minutes. So I'm gonna go quickly. So I talked a little bit about the licensing requirements, criminal history investigation on all parties, on all spouses. Believe it or not, the initiative requires that even investors and financiers of producers, processors, or retailers must go through a criminal background check. So if you have any interest in the license whatsoever, you have to go through a criminal background check in order to meet the requirements for a license. You have to go through a financial background. You have to tell us where you got the money to create the business that you're going to have through the license. You have to provide bank records. You have to tell us where the money came from. You have to have a 6-month residency requirement in the state. In Colorado, it's actually 2 years. I think it would have been easier if it was 2 years, because what we had people doing was moving in from outside the state. The residence requirement in the initiative was 3 months. It was changed by the legislature to 6 months, because what we had people doing is moving in, holding residency for 3 months, and then applying for a license. And that was pretty difficult to determine whether they really met the residency requirement or not. But the idea here in the 6-month residency or the 2-year residency in Colorado is to do what? Was to create a business for Washingtonians, by Washingtonians, And that was the intent of putting these residency requirements in. You don't find that for any other commodity, including alcohol. And then they placed in the initiative, which was difficult for us, a requirement that none of these properties, the producer, processor, or retailer, could be 1,000 feet from school, child care center, transit centers, game archives, libraries, playgrounds, and public parks. And then we actually had to go in by rule and define what that was, because we had people in cities who didn't want any retail locations, who literally put a bench up and maybe a basketball court and said, this is a park. And we said, no, that's not a park. It has to be registered by the city as a park. We've had people who opened game archives where they thought that people were going to apply and seek a license, trying to put a business there that would block the ability for that retail location to be there. So that's been a bit of a task for us, trying to determine what fits it. But the nice thing is the cities and others, they have definitions for what are, for instance, public parks. I talked about the diversion in and out of the state. So there's a pretty robust, comprehensive system that traces the product from seed to sale. If I'm a producer, if I move anything in my premises with respect, and if you've been in a producer or a processor outlet, there's different growth cycles. They move the plants from place to place. They harvest in one area. Whenever anything is moved, it must be placed in the traceability system so we know where that product is. So are there any licensees in the room? One. Thank you. I was just curious. So producer, processor, or retailer?
Producer, processor.
And here in Spokane? Holman.
The only one in Pullman.
Thanks for joining us. So here's one thing that we're not used to, because, of course, the feds don't recognize it as legal. We had to figure out how to package and label this product. Typically for alcohol, it's already approved by the TTB, the packaging of a bottle of vodka, for example. It comes to the state already labeled and meeting requirements with respect to bottling. We had no idea. We went to Colorado. Colorado had really good packaging and labeling requirements, and so we took those regulations that they had and probably went a little further than them, because just as we were putting our regulations together, people were jumping out of buildings in Colorado, because what were they doing? They were eating infused and edibles that had up to 400 milligrams of THC in them. So we immediately wrote rules that said that a product could have no more than 100 milligrams, single serving of no more than 10 milligrams. And I'm telling you, that's pretty strong product, but much less than what was going on in Colorado. Subsequently, Colorado copied our regulations because they were having problems, not only with the politics, but the public upset that there was too much THC in the product. But I just wanted to share with you the testing and that has to occur by law, by the producers and processors. And one of the things that we did initially that was available in the medical marketplace, and I think maybe still is today, I had no idea you could buy gummy bears, you could buy cotton candy, you could buy ice cream, you could buy all these different products that we felt. So we wrote a rule, an emergency rule, that said nothing can be sold as far as edibles or infused products that are especially appealing to children. We had to use the word especially because there are a lot of products that adults eat and children eat that are appealing to both. Cookies, for example. So anything with bright colors, anything that mimics a candy. You wouldn't believe there's a lot of candies that the cannabis industry mimics in the medical. So anything that if I were to throw it on a table, a child might be appealing to it. Bright colors, for example. So we ban that. We require some pretty strict labeling. Obviously, people need to know that there's marijuana in the product, but that's something that we did that subsequently Colorado also is doing with respect to recreational. I talked a little bit about lab testing, and we have 14 accredited labs, independent labs throughout the state. We don't allow minors in our stores. You have to be 21 and older to come into the stores to purchase, and then there are product and usage signs within the stores. So I'll just very quickly, what's the size of the marketplace? This is even a little low, because I know we hit 750 producers and processors statewide, and I think we're at 210 licensees. statewide, retail licenses statewide. You can go to our website, and everything is there. We move everyone to the website just like everybody does. We have a map that you can see. You can actually click on the specific locations and see where the producer processors and retailers are located. And that's available on our website. So the estimate was that we would have $38.6 million in revenue the first fiscal year. And obviously we exceeded those sales by a lot. And have now hit almost $500 million in sales and about $70 million the first fiscal year, which is double the number that we expected. And what's ironic is that we had set up 334 retail locations statewide the first year. And so working with our consultant, what we believed is that we would capture somewhere between 5 to 13% of the marketplace the first year. And I'm telling you, it's just a guesstimate. We really don't know what the entire size of the black market or the medical market is. We're going to find out here in the next month what Dr. Kleinman thinks, how big the medical is, because that's going to determine how big this marketplace is going to come in the next 2 years, how many more producer processors we need to license and how many more retail locations. But with 200 retail locations, and that's just recently, we assumed 334, we still exceeded sales that we expected. I can't even tell you what size of the marketplace we captured today. But it's sizable, it'll continue to grow. The estimates are, so I'll just give you, it's anecdotal, so I don't know how important it is, so I probably shouldn't say it, but we have about $1 billion in spirit sales today, people buying hard liquor. That's about what the sales are. We believe that probably in the next 2 to 3 years that we'll have somewhere between $800 and $1 billion in sales in marijuana, and it could be higher. I think one of the things that's difficult to determine is how big the marketplace is and how many people actually consume. If you read, there was a Wall Street Journal article today. There was a study that was done at Columbia University that suggests that in the last 10 years, there's been a 100% increase or a doubling of those who consume marijuana over 21. So in 1999, they estimated that it was about 5%, and they believe today it's about 10% of those over 21 consume marijuana, which is interesting because what happened around that time? Medical marijuana by initiative was approved in 1998. Many of the states in the West, including Colorado, in somewhere between 98 and 2004, passed medical marijuana laws. So it makes sense to me that what was a significant thing that happened, medical marijuana became available for people to purchase. And I tell this to a lot of groups that I speak to, just being honest and candid and frank about it. I've not met anyone that's ever been denied an authorization card for medical marijuana. There are huge loopholes in the law that allow people who have acute pain to be able to get an authorization for marijuana. I believe people use it for both. They use it for medical and they use it for recreational. I mean, that only makes sense. But the reason that this whole reconciliation is occurring is because it's unregulated today. So let me move on because I promised I'd give you a chance. So here's the kind of growth that we saw month for month in the first year, and it continues to grow, as I said earlier. When we first began the marketplace last July, there was an undersupply. So what happens when you have an undersupply? You pay $30 a gram to get marijuana, and sales stall. So what happened after last fall when the first crops, the outdoor grows from Eastern Washington, and all the indoor growths came in, we had an oversupply. So what happens when we have an oversupply is the price of marijuana comes down substantially to the point that we're probably somewhere around $13 a gram. In fact, I know there are retailers that advertise $10 Tuesdays. It's interesting in the black market and the medical market, what happened? The price went down. So you can go and find grams for somewhere between $5 and $8 right now in the black market or in the medical market because it's a response to the fact that they need to keep their businesses open because they have to compete with what now? With the legal marketplace. So you can see that the prices have dropped. And so what happened when the price dropped? People started coming to the stores. So I can tell you, it was interesting when this first began, the demographic was people my age were going to the stores. You know why? Because they had the money to pay $20 and $30 a gram. And why else? Because it's safer, it's been tested, I know what I'm smoking, it labels and tells me how much THC is in there. So it's pretty ironic that you got a medical marketplace out there that generally doesn't test, generally, what I've been told is 30% of the marijuana that's grown outside the legal marketplace, 30% of it has fungicides or fungus on the marijuana. I don't think people know that they're consuming marijuana that isn't safe a lot of the time. And so I just wanted to share with you, as the supply increased and the prices dropped, now we have a clientele that really represents the demographic of people who like to consume marijuana. Bans and moratoria. So just when things weren't crazy enough, all these cities and counties decided that they were going to impose bans that wouldn't allow for the sale, the growth, or the retailing of marijuana. A lot of them in eastern Washington. Now, so how is that significant? Because we have more counties and cities that have bans that don't, but I'll tell you why it's not that relevant. Only 20% of the state population lives east of the mountains. 2/3 of the population lives in 3 counties: Snohomish, King, and Pierce. Only Pierce County, unincorporated, has imposed a ban. That means, I think AWC, the Association of Washington Cities, estimated that you would drive no longer than 10 minutes to find a retail location for cannabis in the most densely populated areas of the state where people live. So if you look at that, we've taken a look at the numbers. About 80% of the population can drive 10 minutes to get cannabis. In Olympia, for example, we have many shops and outside the unincorporated areas of Thurston County. So while there are a lot of bans and moratorias, most of the population is served where people live. And then you see pockets like in Yakima County, where I grew up. Yakima County and the city of Yakima has a ban, right? But Union Gap, which is just literally outside of Yakima, has, I don't know, I think 4 or 5 shops right now. So people in Yakima are driving to Union Gap. Moxie, which is just right outside of Yakima, has several growers and processors there. So you can see, even in eastern Washington, pockets of areas. Pullman's a great example, where there are bans around you, but not in the city. Pullman, bans around Kittitas County. I went to Central in Ellensburg, but Ellensburg's legal, so what do you guys have in common? I guess there's a university. So, real quick, banking has been a real issue, and we work with Denny Heck, who's a congressman from our area in Thurston County, and with Congresswoman Del Bene, to try to get the federal government and their federal regulators, the banking regulators that represent the largest banks, obviously have concerns about providing financial services to those involved in this business here in Colorado, in Oregon. And we've said, how are you going to keep this clean if you've got people walking around with bags of cash because you're not providing financial services? So actually, Congresswoman Del Bene has introduced a bill that allows for those states that have legalized for the federal banking regulators to remove some of the restrictions that they have right now. Most of the large banks, the national banks, will not get involved in the business because, of course, they're being regulated by federal banks. The good thing that's happened is there's 4 state credit unions, one of them in Spokane, that's allowing banking service. The Washington State Employees Credit Union, which is statewide, just opened their doors in the last few days. So we believe that's an important way of making sure that this is legal and we don't have the problems of people bringing cash, which we get at the liquor board when people come in to pay their taxes. We've got to create a system where people can use their financial institutions for their business just like any other business. I don't have enough time to get into medical because I want to give you time to ask questions of me, and we're already 10 minutes over what I wanted to give you. But I'll share with you what happened in the medical marijuana reconciliation bill was they created what in the law was called a merit system. And the idea of it, and we weren't involved in that, that was something the legislature did, was determine that anyone who had had a dispensary before I-502 passed would have the first priority at a license. So there's 4 criteria, and I'll tell you what they are really quick. 1, you had a dispensary before I-5 or January of 2013, a couple of months after the initiative passed. You've been paying taxes and fees to the Department of Revenue, and you have justification. You can show that you paid those. You had a business license, and you originally applied for a license with the state when we opened the window when I-502 started. And that's the way the initiative wrote it. So it's likely, there's 3 priorities. It's likely that there aren't going to be, I don't think, that many that fall into priority 1 or priority 2. People have estimated in the fiscal note that was written on the bill that there were 1,100 dispensaries statewide. I think there were more. That 800 would apply, that 400 would receive a license. We opened the system up last Monday. To date, we have 450 people that have applied for retail licenses, and the window will remain open. And so we'll begin to process those and see if folks make it through that system. But I can tell you, they got to go through that merit system, then they got to meet the requirements that we have to hold a license. So it's going to be interesting to see how many people actually get a license. And probably what the medical folks are concerned about, if you do not have a license with the state by July 1st of 2016, then you will be deemed illegal by the state. And so people are trying to get into the new system, but I can share with you that I think there's some challenges in that happening, the way that the bill was written. I'm going to go through this because I want to give you a chance. The Brookings Institute, this gentleman wrote a pretty comprehensive report of the systems that Colorado and Washington put in place in August of 2014. If you ever have a chance to look at it, it's long, it's 30 pages I think, but it's a really well done comprehensive review, which you never see these days, of what happened in Washington and what happened in Colorado, how the systems are different, how the systems were built. I think it's fair. So if you're looking for information about what exactly did they do in Washington and Colorado and how are they different, I think this is a really well done review of that. And so with that, I'm going to, I got to give you this website. So if you want any information with respect to the system that we've put in place, you can go to lcb.wa.gov and you'll see dashboards and maps and fact sheets and FAQs and timelines. And so we'll be visiting the state in November with new regulations that we've written around medical marijuana and the reconciliation with retail. And so with that, I'll stop talking and let you ask some questions.
So we got about 15 minutes or so. Maybe I'll start. Do you have any estimates on what's been the impact on the black market since legalization? How much of the new legalized market is new use, and how much is being migrated over from the black market?
So we don't know. Here's some anecdotal stuff that we hear. That Mexico's not moving as much pot into the country as they did before. That BC Bud isn't moving down as quickly as it was before. In those states that have legalized, there tend to be an effort to stop moving marijuana in. I have no idea. I mean, it's still business that they got today. We have not captured anything near what the marketplace is, but anecdotally, that's what we hear. That I can tell you, if you talk to the DEA, they're still busting and bringing down outdoor grows in eastern Washington and on the Yakima Reservation in the same numbers that they did a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So I just think it's so early that it's impossible to know how much of the marketplace is being driven by the legal market, how much percentage is. But it's really too hard to know right now. Yes, sir.
What are the social, political, and economic factors behind the change in the taxes from 25, 25, 25 to 37, I think?
37.
Yeah.
I think the idea was,
What were the changes?
well, a couple of things I heard. Those who had producer-processor licenses who were paying those taxes, and you can probably speak to
We're
it.
paying more now whenever we've been to one of the retailers in the city. Instead of paying, we have a producer-processor license, so if you don't have a producer-processor license and you're moving it from a producer to a processor, the processor would have to pay a 25% tax. But if you have a producer-processor license, you can negate that. But
Right.
now that the tax rate has been up to 37.5%, we're
At the retail.
paying more, right, at the retail.
Right. But, so I asked Allison Holcomb this because the tax rate in Colorado, when it passed, was 20%. Obviously, it is 25, 25, 25. I asked her, why would you tax it so high? Why wouldn't you come in, if you're trying to bring something in that was illegal, give it a lower tax and maybe raise it over time because you're competing with a black market and a gray market? And she said, it's weed, Rick. I said, tell me more. She said, it's easy to grow. The margins and the profits that are in the gray and black market are so high that they exceed the taxes that are imposed. The only thing I differ with her on that is we've imposed burdens on the businesses with respect to traceability system, with respect to the security systems. The cost to put the business together now, I can't even imagine what it was compared to what it was because there wasn't anything you were required to do. So I think it's difficult right now for anybody that's involved in the marketplace, whether you're a producer, a processor, or a retailer, because of the restrictions that have been imposed. And I really believe that the future, people can hang on if they can get it down to a Schedule 2. If more states legalize, then the state will have the ability to remove some of the barriers that it's created because of the fear, and it's a legitimate one, that if you don't strictly regulate this, if this is just a siphon to go out to other states that are illegal and have taken the position that they wish to be illegal, then we will step in and we will stop the experiment that's going on in these states. I think it becomes that. I don't see that happening. People talk about, well, you're going to have a new administration, and if you have a new administration, what's the new administration going to do? I don't know, maybe I'm just getting cynical in my old age, but once the banks are involved in this business, once industry, the secondary, the third string of industries involved, and it's not just cannabis, but you've got there are a lot of different, there's supplies, we've got glass shops all over the state, there's lots of businesses that are being spun off in the new industry, and I just have a hard time believing, regardless of which party it is, that they're going to make an effort to bring action against the states, especially if they're strictly regulated like we are. I think it's hard to work under the system, to be honest with you. So
Very hard. Cameras in every room.
yeah, cameras in every room. I mean, it's really strict.
The BioTrack system, which is a seed-to-sale transaction, so nothing, we don't, like the growers, the producers, we don't even get to sample our own product. We get 1 gram per flowering lot. And a flowering lot is pounds of weed.
So we're looking at that.
Yeah.
Doesn't make sense.
One of the things that cropped up in Colorado recently was this idea of safe fertilizers, safe insecticides, safe fungicides, things
Pesticides,
like that.
yeah.
And especially when you're talking about marijuana, which burns at a higher temperature than tobacco, it would seem to me that there's not a lot of great data on what exactly is safe to be burning at those temperatures. So are we just kind of guesstimating and erring on the side of caution to make sure things are safe, or are there efforts
Well,
being
here's a
made?
concern, and I was just sharing it before I spoke. The policy is way ahead of the research around cannabis. It's disturbing. And why is it? Because you can't get federal money because it's illegal, right? So the institutions like this one, or UW, when we were talking a little bit about that earlier, some colleges are reluctant to do anything around this. Your academic institutions and your research institutions are the ones that you need putting millions of dollars into knowing more about cannabis. And I sit with folks, I'll be honest with you, and they say, it's safer than alcohol. Well, it is safer than alcohol, but it's not safe. It's not safe. A lot of people combine it, alcohol and cannabis. So I'm not here to say, that it's not safer than alcohol. I'm just telling you, I've met a lot of people that consumed too much cannabis over the last couple of years being a regulator. And I can see that people abuse this just like they abuse alcohol. So we want to have responsible sales, right? We want people to consume responsibly. I've heard this for alcohol for 80 years. A lot of people abuse it. So I just share with you as a regulator, you got to be careful because 44% of the population did what? They voted no. They didn't want to do this. And there's reaction out there. And as you have people who believe, and I believe it's probably the proper policy, to be honest with you. I understand the argument that the war on drugs failed. I believe that's true. But there's always, there's a balance there. I had real concerns about it. I voted no. I voted no because I have a 14-year-old, a 17-year-old, and a 21-year-old. And I'm concerned about that. But at the same time, is it working to make it illegal? It's not. People are still consuming. When it was illegal, now it's legal. Hopefully it's safer. But to your question, I think we're just now figuring out the protocols that we want. We test for pesticides, but we're not testing for pesticides. We're telling you through the Department of Agriculture what pesticides you can use. We don't even have testing protocols for pesticides right now. We need to do that. But a lot of it has to do with the fact that we don't have a place to go to get that kind of information that would allow us to make the decisions. And remember, this is a state responsibility right now to make sure that this is a legal, safe product. And so we need more research around it.
I was going to ask, what about the industrial hemp industry that could be coming up in the future? Because I know there was a farmers bill passed by President Obama that allows the growing of industrial hemp, but is there no way that the state can fund universities like it's like the biggest agricultural school in Eastern Washington, but it's not any way we can...
Well, it should be doing it for hemp, but it should be doing it for cannabis too. I got people that are upset that there's these rural 5-acre lots where people were given producer processor licenses, and they're upset, and they say, well, I'll just grow hemp and then it'll ruin the crop for the cannabis producer and processor. But I don't know a lot about what's going on with hemp, but I know a lot of folks right now, because it's illegal federally, are reluctant to do the kind of work that needs to be done.
Tuition is being rolled back. What's the connection with the marijuana income for the state?
The revenues? You said tuitions are being rolled back?
Rolled back, yes.
Some people say that the reason that they came up with a budget this year is because of $300 million in revenue from cannabis. Hard to believe because the state budget is almost $40 billion. But there's so much dysfunction, honestly, between the parties and each house in the legislature that they struggled to get a budget. But they do believe that that had a lot to do with it, that the $300 million that's estimated for the next biennium helped the budget. One of the things that Allison Holcomb did in the initiative, and you can go to our website and find it, is there's a distribution through the initiative, and a lot of it doesn't go to the general fund. It was supposed to go to the basic health care plan that became the National Health Care Act, and what did the legislature do? They took some of the money from that. So there's an effort by those that ran the initiative to make sure that health, prevention, University of Washington, WSU get a little money out of that. But I don't think the money's coming where it's supposed to be coming as far as education. Yes, sir.
I read a bill, I think it was Senate Bill 2326, that was talking about a marijuana research license. And it's only 2 pages long, very easy read. Authorizes UW and Wazoo to do cannabis research, but finding that very difficult to do with a campus that doesn't want to address cannabis, and they don't want to do anything. The state won't fund anything because why would they if it's illegal federally? So how is a producer or a processor supposed to come up with new products by breeding these cannabis plants? If we can't do the research because we don't have the space, we all have these tiered canopy levels.
So here's a dysfunction. The research license that you talked about was authorized by the legislature. The Life Sciences Discovery Fund at the University of Washington is supposed to be they're supposed to provide the panel that would determine whether the research that you want to provide is going to be authorized or not. Guess what happened to the Life Sciences Discovery Fund?
Get cut.
It was eliminated. So they have to finish the projects that they're currently working on, and they're not going to be able to do some of the work that we wanted them to do for us, which is they would determine whether they could do the research or not, the entity, and then we would grant the research license. So we're going to have to go back to the legislature and figure out who the authority is going to be that's going to determine whether someone qualifies to do that research. It isn't going to be us. It's going to be a panel of scientists and academic experts that are going to tell us whether that makes any sense or not.
So
Yes,
my
sir.
question is, do you know if Washington State can use any of the data or policy approaches of other countries that have, allowed it?
Use it.
So use like the research, say, from European countries that have more relaxed approaches towards.
Israel's done a lot of research around cannabis. I don't know why they couldn't. There was a question back here. How about someone who hasn't asked a question?
Back in the day, alcohol flowed freely, and then decided to make it illegal, and it took a constitutional amendment to do that, and then another one to undo it. Where did the legitimacy of any law come from about making cannabis illegal from either federal or state?
So that was like,
That was,
that was in the 50s, wasn't it?
so
1923.
1923?
23, yep.
That was Henry
And swing.
Hanslinger. Yeah, it was that guy.
Yeah.
That's why it's called marijuana.
There was no proof of anything being a problem with marijuana health-wise until Anslinger hyped up Congress about it. And then all these laws came out. Where was the authority to ban that? Because if you do that, why can't you ban my tomatoes grown in the backyard?
Under the Legalizing rates, actually, that is something we could actually regulate with the Congress funds. That decision suggested that because of the plenary power of Congress to regulate through the Commerce Clause, the fact that marijuana grown in your own home meant you weren't buying it elsewhere. And because of that connection to interstate commerce, it was thus okay to regulate. And I realize it's a huge stretch, but that's how they work.
Well, it is a huge stretch. In fact, the judge in Whitman County told me that he agreed that the Commerce Clause is greatly stretched past its snapping point. But the point is, again, you could do the same thing with tomatoes.
Well, they
Where does
can't-
it end?
they can't.
Where's the line, and how do they cross that line?
Yeah, I don't know how to
they
answer
did
that.
it illegally, but it just seems like there's a lot to do about nothing.
What's happening in the criminal justice side of this, as far as trends in state level crimes, and what's happening with people who have been convicted of state crimes, who are still incarcerated?
Yeah.
Is there anything happening there?
So funding came to the Institute for Public Policy at the Evergreen State College. They actually did a report in September. There wasn't a lot there. If you look at the report, there's not a lot of information out there yet about that issue. Prosecutors and law enforcement were not happy, obviously, to see this pass. And given that the fact that medical marijuana was not regulated, they had not taken any action to do much in Western Washington. In Eastern Washington, it's been quite different. The U.S. Attorney in Eastern Washington, Mike Hornsby, has closed dispensaries for years. J.D. Durkin on the west side chose not to do that. I think people have looked away for the longest period of time. So I think the legalization through I-502, now the reconciliation of medical to create some regulation or licensure will mean that the locals will now take a different attitude toward those that are out there, either in the black market or the gray market. I don't know if that's good or bad. I'm not going to judge it. But you asked me. I think law enforcement has been reluctant on the west side of the state to do anything because there is a medical marijuana law that says you can consume if you have a provider or you grow these many plants. So I think there was an acknowledgement that if you go to court on something like this, you're probably not going to win if you're a prosecutor. But now you've got a law that basically says If that dispensary is not licensed by the state by July 1st of 2016, it's illegal. And the idea is that those prosecutors and law enforcement will go after that. Whether that's good or bad, I'm not going to judge it. I'm just telling you that's what they wrote in the law.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
Yes, sir.
Are you addressing the possibility of online sales?
Or delivery. Or to end on that, what about deliveries?
Yeah. So what do we know about online sales of anything? It's impossible to enforce, control, regulate. We don't. I mean, like anything, it's the same with alcohol. It's like a complaint basis. You know, somebody sends us an email that says, "Did you see what people are doing from California? They're selling, you know, spirits into the state illegally." And we'll take the complaint. We'll go off the complaint. If you think there's any way to regulate internet, let me know. My understanding is it's impossible, and they can't even derive taxes from it right now. So I think that's a struggle we're going to have, whether it's cannabis, whether it's alcohol, whether it's, you know, music. It doesn't make any difference. I wish I could tell you that it wasn't.
Okay, I'm afraid our time is up now. Before I ask you in joining me in thanking our guest, let me remind you our next Coffee and Politics